Chapter 601. Maze and Mr. Hannigan were both taken aback for a moment when they saw the intruder. Maisie threw her handbag on the table, and the metal chain made a crisp clank as it slid across the coffee table. The sudden noise scared Maisie. Maisie sashayed around the desk, walked up to Nolan's side, turned around, and sat down in his arms. Her eyes were bloodshot as she hit him. "Knowles, you bastard. You told me last night when we were in bed that you'd only marry me. You're already going back on your own words by thinking about dating someone else." Nolan grabbed her hands and glanced at the woman in his arms. "There's no such thing. You were just doing it." Maisie smacked him on the chest, acting exceptionally aggrieved. "Is it because I am not curvy enough, or am I not beautiful enough? You ungrateful liar." The office became dead silent. All of a sudden Mr. Hannigan and Maisie's expressions looked slightly stiff, and even Quincy, who was standing outside the door, was astonished. Maisie then asked reluctantly, "Noel, who is she?" "Noel? Who do you think you're addressing?" Maisie looked at her in dissatisfaction. Although the large black-framed sunglasses covered almost half of her face, her stern arrogance did not diminish. "News about Nolan losing his memory has just gone out. And you're already here trying to take advantage of him by impersonating his ex-girlfriend. If you're his ex-girlfriend, doesn't that make me his ex-wife?" Maisie looked upset. Where did this woman come from? Isn't she acting a little too presumptuously? She then took a glance at Nolan subconsciously. The legendary Mr. Goldman wouldn't tolerate any random woman who acts like a madwoman in his office, right? Unexpectedly, not only did Nolan not make a fuss out of the drama, but he also seemed to have let it slide. Mr. Hannigan leaned slightly forward and forced a smile. "Mr. Goldman, I know that you can't remember Z, but it doesn't matter." Mr. Hannigan. Nolan interrupted him indifferently as his expression turned cold. "I don't want to hear the word name Z come out of your mouth again from now on. You can stop calling her that, or you can choose to get your daughter to change her name. I'll leave that to you to decide." Cold sweat droplets were rolling down Mr. Hannigan's temples. What's going on? Isn't he suffering from amnesia? He was not sure whether Nolan was really suffering from amnesia or this was just a show. He was afraid to stay for a second longer as it might make things even more embarrassing for the Hannigans. Thus, he brought Maisie along and left the scene. Maisie looked back at Maisie. "This woman actually beat me to it. I have to look thoroughly into her background after this." After the others left, Nolan lowered his eyes, and the amusement hidden at the bottom of his eyes could no longer be concealed. Quincy was kind enough to send the father and daughter duo out, so only the two of them were left in the office. Maisie felt a little tired after all the acting. She was about to pick up her handbag when Nolan pulled her into his arms. He buried his head into her shoulder and smiled. "You're jealous." Maisie snorted softly. "Since when am I jealous? I just can't let it slide when others take advantage of your amnesia and try to make a fool out of you." Nolan's thin lips were hovering over her skin, and he said with a low chuckle, "My wife looks so voluptuous and gorgeous. Not to mention her special skill set when it comes to seducing her husband. Why would I want someone else?" Maisie noticed the change in his attitude, and her expression stiffened. Nolan Goldman -Z. Nolan hugged her tightly as if he was planning to melt her down solely with his body's warmth. "I want you. Don't you even dare to think about it. Why are you mad at me?" Nolan's pecs went upward until his lips were in the position to press against hers in a domineering and affectionate manner. Maisie was not strong enough to stop Nolan. So the gap in between each breath gradually narrowed, and it was astonishingly warm. She managed to catch a deep breath after a long time, and a layer of fog seemed to have filled up the area surrounding the both of them, everything seeming blurred and captivating. The emotions that Nolan had been suppressing surged and peaked. He picked her up and carried her into the bathroom. After a long time, Quincy still had not stepped into the office, nor had he let anyone in. Sadie waited outside the door and did not see Maisie come out. So she wanted to enter, but Quincy stopped her. He let off a polite smile. Miss Sadie, Ms. Vanderbilt is having a steamy moment with Mr. Goldman, so it's best if we don't disturb them. Chapter 602. Sadie gave him a sideways glance. Quincy then asked with a grin, "Are you thirsty, Miss Sadie? Do you want a drink?" No. Sadie crossed her arms, rejecting Quincy's kindness. Without any hesitation, Quincy did not ask again. Nolan buttoned Maisie's clothes for her while she could not even stand up straight and steadily. He hugged her by her waist to support her and laughed. "What a shameless woman," she scoffed. "You're the shameless one here. What do I have to be ashamed of?" Nolan was astonished for a moment. Then raised his head to look at her as if he had seen this scene somewhere, and he seemed to have said such a sentence in the past too. When Maisie left the company, Nolan sent her out personally. All the employees inside the company witnessed Nolan wrapping his arms around her shoulders with their own eyes, looking extremely intimate. My God, am I seeing that right? Mr. Goldman has found himself a new lover? Those people had different expressions. Everyone knew that Nolan had been very affectionate to his wife back then. Mr. Goldman's wife has only been gone for 3 years, and he's forgotten his previous lover already. Of course, some thought that this was normal. After all, the dead can't come back to life. In addition to that, Mr. Goldman is still so young and healthy, so life goes on. What's more, Mr. Goldman is suffering from amnesia. It's completely normal for him to forget about his wife, who ran into an accident back then. At the Goldman mansion, Nicholas read through the nonsense published in the newspaper, snorted, and flung the newspaper on the table. These companies are truly shameless enough to try to take advantage of my son when he's suffering from amnesia. Alfred, who was standing beside him, poured tea for him and said with a smile, "Even if Mr. Goldman doesn't remember, he's not someone that can be easily fooled." Nicholas picked up the teacup. "It seems that there's a need for me to meet the owners of those companies now. It's time to show them who's the boss." In just under 2 days, no other company dared to send in any other contract to Black Gold. It was said that the owners of those companies had learned their lesson ever since they met Nicholas in person and did not dare to come up with schemes to take advantage of Black Gold anymore. Nicholas had been living in the Goldman family estate, had retired from the business circle, and had turned a blind eye to the industry's affairs. However, brushing those matters aside did not mean that he was no longer the capable top gun that he once was. As the saying went, the older, the wiser. Although no one knew what Nicholas had done, he had done his part at least when it came to protecting his son. Maisie was in her office, drawing some designs. Sol had not released any new products over the past 3 years ever since her accident. She still had to live up to a promise that she had made to Madame Nera back then. And now that she was back, it was time to send Sol Jewelry's reputation to its peak. She handed the drafts to Kennedy after just one morning. Kennedy took a glance at the artwork in his hand and asked in surprise, "This is?" Maisie replied immediately, "This is the inspiration of the designs that I aim to come up with this time around. Sol has always focused on our Gothic jewelry design. So I plan to combine the darkness that we usually turn to with some color palette." Sol's Gothic designs had always placed a lot of focus on the mystery of the jewelry, which looked extremely distinct from that of the gorgeous and colorful designs. The fusion of these two design languages would definitely create a brand new visual effect. Kennedy propped his hand against his chin. "Do all your designs come in pairs?" Maisie gave off a smile. "Yes, our new products will focus on designs that came in pairs. And we'll name them the Inseparable Bond. They're here mainly to attract couples." Maisie's cell phone that was placed on the desk rang as soon as Kennedy left her office. She picked it up, placed it next to her ear, and Riley's roar came from the other end of the call. "Z. Did your husband cheat on you?" Maisie distanced the phone away from her ear subconsciously. "What are you talking about?" You need to pay more attention to the gossip that's going around the circle. Everyone is now talking about the woman that came out of black gold in Nolan's arms 2 days ago. Chapter 603. Maisie burst into laughter. Yes, he cheated on me. He cheated on me with me. Riley was quiet for a few seconds. Oh, so it's you. What were you two doing at that time? What else could I do? Maisie stopped writing and raised her gaze. Everyone in Basburg knows that he has divorced me. So if I were to reveal my identity to the public swaggeringly while Nolan is still suffering from amnesia, he'd have to face the media while he can't remember a thing. How troublesome would that be? Riley clicked her tongue and said, "Why do you care so much about your amnesiac husband's feelings now?" Maisie did not say much, but instead asked, "I wonder where did you get this gossip? It hasn't even appeared on the news or the internet. Yet you've already heard about it." I was added to a celebrities WhatsApp group chat by some of my friends a while back. They were gossiping about this, and I've been reading their messages without responding to any of them. After saying so, Riley remembered something and added, "By the way, Pearl Santiago is in the group too." Pearl Santiago was a name that Maisie was relatively familiar with. She was the lady who had joined forces with Willow to set up Maisie back then but had gotten the short end of the stick due to Maisie's countermeasures. It was said that the Santiagos had sent Pearl abroad for a series of psychotherapies after that incident. And Pearl had returned to Zlokova now that the heat of that incident had subsided. Riley told Maisie that Pearl had only returned to Zlokova last year. Apart from that, she had lost the arrogance and dominance that she exuded back then and had become someone more mature and low-key after that incident. After all, she was the victim of that incident, and no one in the circle would rub salt into her wounds so casually. They would be more inclined to pity her for her previous experience. By the way, Pearl got engaged to the Hannigans last month. Maisie frowned. The Hannigans? Riley replied, "Yes, the family has a hotel chain business empire. Mr. Hannigan has a son and a daughter." "Oh yeah. You've met his son before this, but I'm not sure whether you have any impression of him. He's a close friend of my cousin and that bastard Louis Lucas. His name is Tanner Hannigan." Tanner was the son that Mr. Hannigan had with his ex-wife, while Maisie was the daughter that Mr. Hannigan had with his current wife and Tanner's younger half-sister. It was rumored that Tanner was not very close to his sister and he rarely mentioned his sister to outsiders in the circle. Their relationship was only made known later on when Mr. Hannigan announced it to the public, and that was when the public learned about them. Tanner had never wanted to inherit his father's business empire, and his relationship with his father was never close. That was also why he always acted as if he was loafing around like an idle man whenever Mr. Hannigan was present. Mr. Hannigan had arranged the marriage between Tanner and Pearl in the past. The Santiagos had always been disdainful of the Hannigans. After all, the Santiagos were involved in a wider and more prestigious circle when compared to the Hannigans. However, things were different now because everyone in Basburg knew about Pearl's incident from back then. Some families might show that they did not mind that incident on the surface, but deep down, they thought otherwise. Thus, the Santiagos were not in the position to be picky when the Hannigans were willing to propose marriage. In the evening, when all the department employees had already left work, Maisie was still manufacturing custom-made jewelry in the workshop located in her office. She put on non-marking gloves and took out the diamonds that had been cut from a brocade box, selected them meticulously under a shadowless lamp, and polished them with a machine. A tall figure appeared outside the door. Seeing that she was concentrating on her work, he leaned against the wall with his arms crossed in front of his chest as he could not bear to disturb her. The sky outside the window got darker and darker as time went by, and the entire floor and the end of the corridor were silently engulfed by darkness. The light and shadow in the office were projected out of the room through the cracks of the door and the window shutters, beaming rays of bright light into the silent and dark corridor. When Maisie finished inlaying the jewelry, she stretched her waist and picked up her phone, only to see that it was already 8 p.m. She packed her things in a hurry, turned off the lights, got up, walked out of the workshop, and was surprised to see Nolan sitting on the couch with his eyes closed. Chapter 604. Nolan's face looked softened under the interlacing white lights and shadows. It was flawless, profound, and attractive that no words could describe his perfection. Maisie walked toward him, lifted her hand, rubbed his eyebrows lightly, and slid her finger down the bridge of his well-defined nose. Nolan frowned, raised his hand, grabbed her wrist, dragged her into his arms, and then slowly opened his eyes to look at her. "You're really a bad woman." Maisie chuckled, placed her hands on his shoulders, and leaned closer to him. "How am I a bad woman?" He then wrapped his arms around her waist. "You're finally done with your work. Are you hungry?" "Yes." She nodded. Nolan hugged her with a smile, pressed his lips and nose against her neck, and gave off a pregnant smirk. "Are you really hungry?" Maisie pushed against his chest feebly. "Stop fooling around already." "I'm really hungry, so hungry that I literally have no strength to do anything now." Nolan stopped messing around, let go of her, and sorted his suit out. "What do you want to eat?" "I'll take you there." Maisie thought about something, grabbed his arm, and smiled brightly. "I haven't eaten ravioli in a very long time. I want to eat ravioli." Nolan had asked Quincy to go back first when he came over, so it was fortunate that Maisie had driven to work today. She could not guarantee that the amnesiac would know the way. She drove her car to a small ravioli shop near Houston Street. The restaurant's signboard had not been changed over the past 20 years. And it looked ancient. Even the restaurant's interior decoration looked very ordinary, simple, and very down-to-earth. Nolan did not seem to have been to such a place to eat before this. Took a look around at the wooden stools and tables in the shop and creased his eyebrows. Maisie ordered 2 sets of ravioli with the proprietress, then walked to a table and sat down. Seeing that Nolan was standing stiffly next to the table, she smiled. "It's good to experience the life of an ordinary citizen once in a while. Isn't it boring to only eat delicacies from all over the world every day?" Nolan sat opposite her and seemed to think that the table was not clean enough, so he took out a tissue and wiped it twice. Maisie rested her chin on one of her hands and stared at him with a grin. "This restaurant's ravioli is very famous. It'll never disappoint you." Nolan raised his head. "Have you been here?" Maisie closed her eyelids. "Riley and I often came here to eat ravioli when we were in high school. This ravioli restaurant is one of the oldest shops that you can find on Houston Street." Nolan threw the tissue into the trash can while the proprietress enthusiastically brought 2 plates of ravioli to the table. "Hi there, you two, please enjoy. All the seasonings are on the table. Feel free to mix and match them yourself." Maisie smiled and nodded. "Thank you." Having said that, she grabbed a bottle of vinegar from the table and poured it onto the ravioli, and then sprinkled chopped chives, minced garlic, cumin, and pepper. Nolan was also a little puzzled by Maisie's strange way of eating while she stirred the ravioli with a spoon. She noticed that he was surprised and smiled. "This is the way of eating that Riley taught me. She has always had a strange way of eating ravioli. But every time these seasonings are presented to me, the flavor suits my taste." She then spooned the ravioli, tasted it, and sent it to the side of his mouth. "Do you want to give it a try?" Nolan stared at the food that she handed over but did not move. Maisie frowned. "You don't despise my saliva, do you?" "How could it be?" Nolan held her hand and shoved the ravioli that she had taken a bite from into his mouth. He then coughed vigorously for some reason. Maisie laughed. "Nolan, are you telling me that you can't handle spicy food?" Nolan grabbed the bowl of beef broth, took a huge sip out of it, and then finally felt relieved. "I never liked spicy food ever since I was a kid." Maisie lowered her eyes and chuckled. "Waylon and Colton are like you. They don't like spicy food, but they both try their best to eat spicy food only because Daisy likes her spicy crayfish." Chapter 605. Nolan stared at her. Daisy is still so young. How can she handle such spicy food? Maybe she's inherited it from me. Maisie took a few sips of broth. I could already eat spicy food when I was only 5. Nolan lowered his head to eat the ravioli in his bowl while she could not hide the amusement that was beaming in her eyes. Is it delicious? Not that bad. Nolan took a few more bites, at least the taste isn't half bad. After finishing all the ravioli, it was already 9 p.m. when they arrived at the Goldman mansion. Alfred claimed that the 2 children had just taken their bath and were watching a movie in the room. Maisie opened the door while Daisy and Colton were watching anime while eating snacks in front of the big projector screen. Mommy, you're back. Daisy shoved the snacks over into Colton's arms, got up, and ran to her. Maisie lifted her hand and rubbed Daisy's hair. It felt so soft to the touch as she had just washed and dried her hair. Didn't your teacher give you any homework? Colton and I finished our homework in school. That tiny amount of homework is not a big deal to the both of us. Daisy said proudly. Colton was chomping down on the potato chips as he muttered, but didn't you have to rely on me, the genius? Daisy glared at him with disgust. You answered the last math question wrongly. Where did you find the courage to proclaim yourself as a genius? I answered the question wrongly on purpose. Colton spread his hands and sighed helplessly. I've always been the best student throughout every semester. How boring is that? So. Aren't I giving you a chance at it now? Daisy responded, since when have you won first place every semester? Didn't the new classmate who transferred into our class this year snatch your best student title from you last semester? Colton waved his hand. I gave him that. Humph. You can continue to act narcissistically. Daisy stood with her arms akimbo. Maybe he'll still be the best student at the end of this semester. Maisie watched as the 2 kids bickered. She lifted her hands to cover her forehead as if she was suffering from a headache. She could not help but miss Waylon, who was in Staslow at the moment. Waylon, only the eldest of the 3, can make me feel more relieved. The next day, Nolan was reading the newspaper while he sat in the living room, eating breakfast with the 2 children. He shifted his gaze off the newspaper and stared at the 2 children. Although he had not regained his memory, he quickly got used to his role as a father. Daisy was biting on her chopsticks while looking at him. Daddy. Will you and Mommy come to our parent-teacher meeting next month? Nolan stopped in the middle of turning the page for a split second, then narrowed his eyes. A parent-teacher meeting? Colton was drinking his milk. Daddy has never been to any of our parent-teacher meetings. Mommy is the one who attended all of them back then. Nolan's expression dimmed. Maisie did tell me when we were still in Staslow that she had given birth to the kids and raised them by herself after finding out she was pregnant. He put the newspaper down, raised his hand, and rubbed Colton's head. Don't worry, I will be there with your mommy next month. The 2 little rugrats exchanged gazes and then stared at Nolan. Really? Nolan stretched out his little finger. Pinky promise. Upon seeing that, Daisy and Colton both made a pinky deal with him. Nolan's eyes were fixed on the fingers that could not be retracted. At Black Gold. Nolan, sitting in the office, looked out the window with a calm expression. He seemed to have remembered something the moment he promised the children. He spread out his palms, rubbed his fingertips against the rough palm prints, and his gaze fell on his ring finger, which was empty at the moment. Yes, no wonder I've always felt that something was missing. Maisie and I don't even have a pair of wedding rings, not to mention the lack of wedding photos at home. He summoned Quincy. Quincy opened the door after a short while. Mr. Goldman, are you looking for me? Chapter 606. Nolan crossed his fingers and put them to his lips as he solemnly said, "Help me get the best wedding photographer in Bassburg." Quincy was stunned. Wedding photographer? Nolan explained with a serious expression, "The walls at home need decoration." Quincy was quiet. He could have just said that he wanted to get some wedding pictures taken. Maisie asked Sadie to take a detour to the Vanderbilt Manor on their way to Soul Jewelry. There wasn't much change in the garden except the vegetation had dried off, because no one had been taking care of the garden. The door was tightly shut. Sadie parked the car, and Maisie pushed open the car door. She looked at the locked door and could tell that no one lived there anymore. Her eyes were solemn. She stood in front of the door for a long, long time, not wanting to leave. The guard walked over to inform her, "I'm sorry, no one is allowed near this place." Maisie turned to look at him. "Why not?" The guard sized her up and said, "The abandoned villa was repurchased, and the owner said that no one is allowed to be near it." Maisie squinted. "Who's the new owner?" The guard patiently answered, "It was a wealthy lady who looked influential." "Do you know how I can get in touch with her?" The guard scrutinized her again. "May I know who you are?" Maisie smiled and showed him her ID. "This was the home of my father, Stephen Vanderbilt." "I'm Maisie Vanderbilt." The guard took a look at the ID and saw that the address on it matched. He then gave her the woman's contact information. Maisie took a glance and thought that it looked familiar, so she went through her contact list and was surprised that the person who had bought the mansion was her aunt, Larissa. Maisie called her, and Larissa requested to meet her at a restaurant. When Maisie got there, Larissa was already in a private room. She slowly picked up her teacup and took a sip. "I bought the Vanderbilt Manor for you. I intended to pass it to you, but it slipped my mind." Maisie was surprised. She walked to the table and sat down. "Why did you buy it?" Larissa put the teacup down. "After your father's accident, Mr. Goldman was put in charge of your father's funeral arrangements. Your father's assets were supposed to go to his next of kin, but since you went missing after the accident, the issue regarding the property rights was put aside. Someone brought over the agreement, and Larissa placed it on the table and pushed it in front of Maisie. I didn't know that after Mr. Goldman was infected with the virus, he couldn't take over property management. During that time, Stephen's mother and brother wanted to take the manor for themselves." Maisie's eyes flashed with anger. She believed that Madame Vanderbilt would have learned her lesson after Layla's mess, but she didn't expect the old woman would want to take over her dead son's assets. They weren't even in charge of his assets. Nolan was. If Stephen knew, he would be extremely disappointed. Maisie recalled something. "How did you know about the Vanderbilt's affairs?" Larissa smiled. "When Willow came to trick me with your mother's bracelet, I looked into them. When I found out about Willow's con, dug into the Vanderbilts more. It hadn't been hard for her to look into them. She had merely lifted a finger to find out about their relations." "Thank you, Aunt Larissa." Maisie picked up the agreement, but something felt off in her heart. After the accident 3 years ago, Strix had taken her under his wing, so she hadn't been able to settle a lot of things by herself. Chapter 607. I'll always be your aunt. At least, you know that you still have me left in this world. Maisie smiled and nodded. Maisie arrived at Soul Jewelry, and she saw Quincy sitting on the couch when she got into the office. Maisie paused and looked around the room. "Quincy. Why are you here? Where's Nolan?" If Quincy were there, so would Nolan. Quincy scratched his face and smiled. "Mr. Goldman asked me to come and get you." "Get me?" "Yes. He said he has a surprise for you and that I should bring you over." Maisie crossed her arms when she saw Quincy acting mysteriously. "What surprise?" "It wouldn't be a surprise if I told you." Quincy put out one arm and bowed. "Shall we go, Ms. Vanderbilt?" Maisie smiled. Why was Nolan preparing a surprise instead of working? That made her curious about the surprise. Nolan made the whole process very mysterious. Not only did she have to be blindfolded on the way there, but Quincy also had to walk her in when she got there. Maisie couldn't see where she was going, so she carefully followed Quincy and asked, "What is going on?" "We're almost there." Quincy handed her over to 2 female helpers. They each took one of her arms and said, "Ms. Vanderbilt, please move forward about 150 feet more." Maisie moved forward and only stopped when they asked her. They then removed the blindfold. She squinted because her eyes had gotten used to the dark, so they had to adjust to the sudden brightness. The blurry vision of a luxurious place slowly came to focus. Under the bright, antique chandelier, an extraordinarily elegant and classy wedding dress stood on the soft woolen rug. The gown was fully handmade with pearls and crystals embellishing the skirt, which was opened like a parasol. Maisie's eyes felt warm. In front of the ceiling-length mirror, a familiar, tall figure approached and hugged her waist from behind while she was still stunned, pressing his cheek to hers. "Do you love it?" Maisie turned her face to look at him. Even his pores were so delicate on his handsome face that was only an inch away from hers. Nolan turned his head and looked into her eyes, his deep-set eyes and thick, long lashes drawing her in. This is the surprise? She would be lying if she said she wasn't touched. Every girl dreamed of their wedding dress and would wish to walk down the aisle in a wedding dress and veil to the man of their dreams and live happily ever after. Hold on. If he brought me over to shop for a wedding dress, could his memories have returned? Had he remembered his promise from back then? She was suddenly anxious. Nolan. Nolan looked into her eyes. His lips were right in front of her, almost kissing. Maisie looked down, hiding her bright smile. "Do you remember now?" Nolan suddenly froze, and his expression darkened for a moment when he saw hope in her eyes. Maisie noticed that minor change in his expression, pushed him away, and held his arm. "Nolan, why did you prepare this surprise?" She thought he had regained his memories. Nolan lowered his head and looked at her for a moment before pulling away his arm. "Forget it." He left without looking back. After that, Quincy was waiting outside and had been under the impression that they had started taking their pictures until he saw Nolan walk out. Chapter 608. Nolan pulled down his tie with a stoic look. The tie fell to the ground, but he didn't look back. Quincy was taken by surprise. "Mr. Goldman." Maisie walked out looking sad, so Quincy walked up to her and asked, "What happened to Mr. Goldman? Weren't you taking your wedding pictures?" Maisie raised her head. "Wedding pictures?" Quincy explained, "Yes, even though he lost his memory, he was fixated on the fact that you had never taken wedding pictures. He even wanted to get wedding rings. Even though he cannot remember what happened, he still cares about you a lot." Maisie stood on the spot, curling her fingers. Even when he didn't remember, he still kept their past in his heart and wanted to make up for it, be it their wedding photos, wedding rings, or his promise of a wedding ceremony. Nolan was angry. Although he hadn't regained his memories, was he supposed to be turned down because he couldn't remember their past? Maisie helplessly chuckled. That childish man, she never said she didn't like any of this. She tapped Quincy's shoulder. "Help me calm him down." Quincy was confused. "Me? Calm him down? Wouldn't it be more effective if you did it?" Maisie kept smiling. "He's an easily agitated 17-year-old boy. I don't think I can calm him down, so he's going to be angry for a few days." Quincy's lips twitched as he watched Maisie walk away. How was he supposed to calm him down? Maisie didn't see Nolan on the day of that incident. He was so angry he blocked her number on his phone. Even when they got back to the Goldman mansion, he wanted to sleep in separate rooms and would rather go cuddle up with Colton instead of speaking to her. Colton and Daisy were confused. When their parents had had arguments in the past, their mother would be the one that acted childishly, yet their father was even more childish than how she was. At Soul Jewelry, Maisie was focused on attaching a pearl onto the jewelry when the phone on the desk started ringing. It was Riley. She answered it and put it on speaker, so Riley's voice floated out. Maisie, that little sit is going to steal Mr. Goldman if you keep ignoring him." Maisie's hand froze. "What did you see this time?" Riley said, "You haven't heard?" Maisie and Mr. Goldman were photographed in a restaurant, and it was posted on social media. Everyone has gone crazy about it, and they say that Mr. Goldman lost his love for his wife along with his memories and has moved on to someone else. Maisie chuckled. Riley wasn't pleased. How could you still laugh? He's a strapping young old man who has lost his memory. He's no longer the cold man that people used to know. Do you think he would be able to resist temptation? Weren't you against him previously? Now you're trying to get me back with him? Maisie smiled and continued carving the pearl in her hand. What Quincy said made me think that he's not a total ass. But no matter what, he's your husband. Maisie wasn't even popular among the socialites. I heard that she hasn't failed to seduce any man just yet. Riley was worried for her. Even though Maisie was nowhere as beautiful as Maisie. She was good at throwing her girlish charms around, a girl that men would fall for, no matter their age. Chapter 609. Maisie didn't say anything. Not long after their call ended, Quincy sent a photo to her. The picture was exactly as Riley had described. Nolan and Maisie were having lunch, and the picture was deliberately taken from an angle that made them look intimate. Maisie scoffed. Had Nolan gotten Quincy to send this to her? Did he want to make her jealous? Quincy waited for a long time for Maisie's reply, and he started panicking. Is Ms. Vanderbilt going to start ignoring Mr. Goldman? Quincy had been concerned when Maisie approached Nolan at the office. Before that, he immediately walked over to Nolan and bent down to say something into his ear. Nolan's hand tightened around the wine glass. And his face dropped. Maisie was sitting across from him, enjoying a steak and wine. She smiled and put down the wine glass. What's wrong, Noel? Nolan placed his glass on the table, wiped the corner of his lips with a napkin, and said, I need to go. He stood up and was about to leave when Maisie stood up. Noel, didn't you promise to finish the meal with me? I've suddenly lost my appetite. Nolan looked at her coldly and walked away in strides. Maisie stood in the spot and bit her lip. She had finally been able to get Nolan out for lunch, but why did he suddenly leave halfway through? She was confident in her looks. Every rich heir in their circle loved how innocent she looked. Maisie might not have had a chance in the past because Nolan had already had a wife. He wouldn't even look at other women, but he had divorced that woman, and she had long passed away. Now that he had even lost his memories, it was the best time to take action. How could he ignore her? Recalling that she hadn't found the identity of that woman from before, she started feeling anxious. No, she couldn't just give up. Everyone knew that Mr. Goldman was famous for pampering his wife. Once he fell in love, he wouldn't care about any other woman. If this beautiful and loyal man belonged to her, he would probably pluck the stars and the moon out of the sky if she wanted them. Nolan got Quincy to drive him to Soul Jewelry. Quincy could guess that after so many days of being ignored by Maisie, Nolan wouldn't be able to hold it in any longer. Maisie's cruelty was definitely working. She hadn't tried to make up or reach out first, just to keep him hanging. Nolan walked toward Maisie's office and closed the door behind him when he walked in. Maisie put down her design papers. She was about to turn around when she was hoisted onto the desk, and her lips were sealed when she tried to speak. Nolan's kiss was burning and fierce, and thick air surrounded her as if she was being swallowed alive. Maisie was almost out of breath as his mountainous body pressed against hers. She couldn't push him away until she was out of oxygen and fell into his arms in a daze. Nolan released his grip, his quick and warm breath blowing on her blushing cheeks. He put his head on her shoulder and hugged her. Are you really done with me? Z? Nolan didn't want to see her being indifferent about him. He had promised to have lunch with Maisie because he wanted to make Maisie jealous so that she would reach out to him. However, he just couldn't wait for her to take the first step anymore and was even worried that she would leave him. Nolan may have lost his memories, but in his heart, he was worried that she would leave him, like how it had happened before. Chapter 610. Nolan's fingers that were holding her shoulder tightened until Maisie put her hands around his waist and put her cheek to his chest to feel his warm, beating heart. Z, Are you done being angry? Maisie glanced at him, looking a little proud. Nolan pressed his thin lips together as if he was being roped in. Maisie adjusted his tie. Had fun having lunch with Maisie? Nolan paused and looked away. Do you know why I was having lunch with her? To make me jealous. Maisie's eyes were smiling. I didn't know if you were really upset with me, so I waited for you to come back to me instead. Would it kill you to make the first move? Nolan felt defeat for the first time, but it probably wasn't the first time it had happened. Maisie kissed his Adam's apple. He frowned, hugged her waist tightly, and said in a deep voice, "Stop it, Maisie." However, Maisie pushed him onto the desk, running her delicate fingers over his brow and around his face and features. You're not difficult to coax. She unbuttoned his shirt. But I didn't want to do that. If I did it once, I'd have to do it again. I don't want to be the one who's chasing you all the time. Nolan stared at her with hungry eyes, ready to pounce. Maisie lowered her head to kiss him. Our relationship is built on trust. I'll always trust you. Even now that you don't remember our past. Nolan quietly hummed. You're doing this deliberately. You taught me this. I'm not happy that you went for lunch with Maisie, so I'm just going to stop halfway. You figure out the rest. Maisie walked into her studio and locked the door. Nolan sat up and ran his finger through his hair, his handsome face still filled with desire. He was annoyed yet helpless. 2 days later, Soul Jewelry posted their first couple collection in their official account, catapulting them back into the trending page after 3 years of silence. The dark theme, combined with colors, looked like two separate pieces of jewelry but were actually a pair made for couples. Even among the diamond rings, the platinum one for women had a black diamond on it, which matched the black diamond ring for men, signifying that each of the rings held one half and would be complete when they came together. The netizens all went to the comments section to ask if Soul had a new designer because they would only sell single-piece jewelry when Zora had been there. Some people thought that the design matched Zora's style and were curious whether they had found someone who matched her style to replace her. The official account quickly replied that it was a new designer named Alice from Morwich. Since she wasn't as popular as Zora and people couldn't find any information about her, everyone became curious about Alice. You're not going to continue using Zora? Kennedy had heard that she cancelled the initial account for Zora and was curious. Maisie looked through the comments and smiled. Zora was the past. Alice is a new beginning. Kennedy knew that she wanted to leave her past behind, so he nodded. That's true. It's good to start over with a new look. Mr. Kennedy. An employee rushed to the door, out of breath. She's back. Kennedy frowned.